Let us turn now perhaps to the recent ISIS attack near Moscow. Uh, who exactly are these Islamists who, so I'm told, so the reports inform us, um, who are these ISIS people who perpetrated this attack near Moscow, and what exactly do they have against the Russians?
Following America's disgraceful retreat from Afghanistan, which was followed by a takeover of the country by the Taliban, there was an ISIS offshoot called ISIS K. The K refers to a city in Afghanistan where they're more or less based, was created. And from time to time, they go after the Taliban, believe it or not, for not being Muslim enough. Many of the members of this organization, ISIS K, come from the former Soviet Central Asia, the stands as we call it, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Dagestan, Tajikistan, regions like this.
Turkmenistan.
I call it who gives a stand, but they have that also. And these regimes that followed in the wake of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, were more or less fascist dictatorships, not Muslim, that were run by families, bully boys, if you will. And many of them had
So
what.
let us go back to what we were saying, that
Okay,
the
so what?
Russians have all these former Central Asian areas and countries on their
Right,
board.
and all of them, but most particularly Uzbekistan, have ISIS affiliated um, Islamist terrorist organizations. Well, because of the need for manpower in the Russo-Ukrainian war, a lot of the Russian security forces that were stationed in the stands, so to speak, to help the local regime stay in power and fight the Islamist attempted takeovers, have withdrawn. So it created something of a vacuum. And so ISIS K, I can't remember the exact name of the city that it refers to, but it's in Afghanistan, now are trying very hard to unseat these governments, whether it's in Tajikistan or any of these other places. So why is ISIS K fighting the Russians?
It should
Well,
just be pointed out, these various regimes are in fact Russian installed and
they're
maintained.
secular regimes, though. They're
Exactly,
Russian
and
installed.
imposing a secular administration and essentially a mafia administration, which is
Correct.
in cahoots with Putin and his cohorts
Absolutely.
and his mafia, doing the bidding of the Russians in order to stay in power. And the local
Right.
populace, by and large, hate these people and
Right.
suffer at their hands, and therefore they have a real beef against the Russians.
Correct. So the people that are more or less fighting these mafia organizations that run the stands um, is ISIS K. So the attack in Moscow basically was a long range strike on their part on behalf of their brethren that are fighting in the various former Soviet Central Asiatic republics to overthrow the secular mafia type regimes. Um, what was amazing was when I realized two things. When I realized that the American embassy had issued a very accurate warning about a week ago that something like this was going to happen, and that they advised people, Russians included, to stay away from large gatherings, such as concerts. And Putin, of course, dismissed it as a bunch of lies, warmongering, whatever he called it. And so it happened. So his attempts now to say, well, the perpetrators were en route to Ukraine, which is not true.
But
But
that's pure
it's
Russian
double talk. I mean, it's just
that's worthy of a Russian novella.
correct. So the other thing that I found amazing was there hasn't been really a word of concerning the appearance of the terrorists in the Russian courtroom. Wow.
Perhaps the United Nations needs to investigate that.
Evidently, one guy had
And
his
the Red
ear
Cross perhaps should go and visit them.
one of them had his ear torn off. One of them looked like he'd been used by a punching bag, used as a punching bag by Mike Tyson. All of them were just absolutely brutalized. And there they are, right in front of the world in their little glass booth that they're put in. And nobody has said a word about this except to just note their condition, their very obvious beaten conditions.
Perhaps Lord Cameron would like to
I
have
was
a
just going to
word.
say, perhaps Lord Cameron would like to demand Red Cross access to these poor freedom fighters before he turns to us.
They are, in fact, to be honest, to be frank, to be um, objective, they are in fact freedom fighters. There is no reason, at least as far at least to this extent, there is no reason why the Russians should have anything to do with Tajikistan or Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. These are not part of historically part of Russia. The people who live there are not Russian. They're not Russian speaking. They want nothing to do with the Russians. They are of a different religion, a different culture, a different language, and they're being oppressed by the Russians indirectly through these mafia
Yeah,
regimes.
yeah. Um, I think
That doesn't make them nice guys. Doesn't make them
no. I
decent,
mean,
friendly, humanitarian people. But they have a legitimate complaint.
they're fighting in a Russian colonialist installed mafia leadership in their countries. The two major countries, right, or the two countries that are experiencing the biggest problem right now with these blokes are Tajikistan, which is right on the Afghan border, and Uzbekistan, where a lot of these terrorists come from. And if you look at the names of these guys, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce them, they're about that long, they're huge. They're all Muslims. They've all been radicalized by ISIS. They all pledged allegiance to ISIS. They have stated their opposition to these mafia leaders that were running all the former stands. So the chickens of empire have come home to roost, more or less, as far as Moscow. Now, what the Russians are going to do right now, I don't know, because they simply don't have the manpower to deploy to regions like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan to handle this problem. But I'll tell you who does have the manpower and who does have the economic presence, if you will, to stop this, and that's the Chinese. The Chinese are equally concerned with in particular, the Uzbek branch of ISIS, because they've been very active in China. So in mostly in the Xinjiang region, Western China. So if things really get out of hand, the Russians would really have to swallow their pride, but the local mafia people may overrule them and simply call in Chinese help for this. And I think the Chinese would be more than happy to accommodate them. And if you really want to see what counterinsurgency is like, the Chinese they don't mess around at all. And so this is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's one that was predicted by the American embassy. They were able to call it right about a week before, and because of Russian pride and arrogance, you've got over 100 people now slaughtered
This is, by the
because
way,
of
further conclusive evidence of the uh, outstanding capabilities of the NSA. America's NSA is
correct
able to pick up chatter information from almost anywhere at any
in the
time.
world.
Uh, their reach is phenomenal, and I actually wonder whether Putin and his cronies did in fact reject these American warnings out of hand, or whether they're just not talking about it now. Maybe they understood something was going to happen, but they had no idea where and when, and you can't just shut down the entire country.
I think the professional Russian security service personnel, despite having blown it in with Ukraine, they're very good, and I think they were concerned about it, but that the higher levels, the political levels at Putin's level, for example, um, did not want to give any credence to the United States in this matter, because it would mean that somehow the United States knew more about what was going on within Russia than the Russians did. Um,
And
it appears to be
we
the
can't have
case,
that.
and we can't have that. You can't have that.